Michigan, or St. Louis?
She lives all over.
All right. I'll start off. What's your name?
Okay. Charles Valier.
Charles Bleer. Yeah. What's your occupation?
I'm retired. I'm an attorney at law.
Okay. Cool. And where do you live?
St. Louis, Missouri, and Charlevoix, Michigan. I split my time equally between the two of them.
And what are you doing here?
I'm visiting family.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna interview Charlie on, I call him Chief, on the Vietnam War and the social movement surrounding it. All right. You ready? And we have Taffy here with us. All right. I'll start off. What was your involvement in the war, and did you have a certain perspective or experience from the social movement?
So I graduated from Yale in June of 1962, and a week later I enlisted in the Marine Corps. And I went on active duty at Parris Island, South Carolina, on August 23rd, 1962. Thereafter, after completing boot camp, I was transferred to Camp Lejeune, and specifically to Camp Geiger, which is on the territory of Camp Lejeune, and for advanced infantry training. Then in the summer of 1963, I was at Camp Lejeune. I was stationed there, and we had they had built a village there, a bamboo village, to replicate a typical Vietnamese village. And so I spent 2 weeks learning how to assault and how to fight hut to hut in a more urban environment. In this case, a Vietnamese.
Was it pretty realistic, the village?
Yeah. And we had they had pop-up targets, and when you would go through, our rifles were at our waist, and we had a controller behind us that controlled the pop-up targets. And it could either be a Viet Cong, a VC, or what we call the VC, or could have been a woman or an old man. It varied, and part of the exercise was being able to react immediately, whether to shoot it or not. I guess my takeaway from that was that in any kind of house-to-house fighting, errors are going to occur. It's impossible when you have a split second and you have to determine whether the person you see is going to kill you or you're going to kill them. That you have to make decisions that may be wrong. And I think that's important in understanding. This was in '63, so we were not involved in the Vietnam War then. We had, President Kennedy had sent advisors over to Cambodia and to Vietnam because of the internal strife that was going on. But I'm thinking that we didn't get heavily involved in Vietnam until about '66. I was in the reserves then, and in law school. And so, and then at the same time, at the end of my first year in law school, I ran for the state legislature, the House of Representatives in the state of Missouri. And I know in '66, there was a question as to whether the President, Lyndon Johnson, was going to call up the reserves and send us to Vietnam. And that spring, my orders were to go to Fallon, Nevada, which is a naval air station in the what's called the Carson Sink. It's a big desert in Nevada to the east of Reno. So I was in an infantry battalion then, and we concluded that we weren't going to Vietnam because there weren't any deserts in Vietnam. And what happened was Johnson decided that the political risk of calling up reserves was too great, and the experience during the Korean War was that the reserves that were called up by President Truman and sent over to Korea didn't perform as well because they were older and they were out of shape, and you can't activate a reserve unit like that and then immediately send them into battle. And so I had he was a camp counselor for me when I was 10 years old, and but he was also the high school football coach. But during the summer, he was a counselor at this camp. And at the end of the summer, I remember the very last day, he showed up in a Marine Corps khakis. He was a captain. He came to say goodbye to all of us. And we were all young kids. We were going into 5th grade and starting at this new school, which was an all-boys school in St. Louis. And so he reassured us that we were going to do well. And then, so that was in August. In early December, the headmaster of the school called us all into an assembly, the whole school, and announced, his name was Tubby Ellis, that he was dead. I later learned that he was killed by a sniper in the battle around the Chosin Reservoir, which was in far northern North Korea near the Chinese border. He was in the 1st Marine Division. The Chinese surrounded the division with 20 what the Chinese called rat divisions, and the 1st Division had to fight its way out. So that was my real. I'd grown up during the war, Second World War, and so I'd seen war, but as a 4- and 5-year-old, you have a totally different perspective than when you suddenly find somebody you know well has been killed.
Thank you. That's good. It's a lot though, seeing maybe someone who's like an idol for you to then just happen to disappear. Really puts the perspective of war.
Yeah, it's human. It's like you and I are talking.
Yeah.
And then I go out the door and find out that you're dead.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, it's just, and we didn't have a mechanism for helping young kids deal with that.
Yeah. It's kind of more on your own back then.
Yeah, so it was a shock, and I still remember it, 70 years later.
Yeah.
So that tells you, what kind of imprint it made.
Yeah.
But during the Vietnam War, I was in the Marine Corps Reserve until June of '68, and I had many friends who went to Vietnam, what we called in-country. If you went to Vietnam, you were considered in-country. And I had other friends that were kind of on the periphery of it. One of them was a pilot. He flew C-130s, which were big cargo planes, out of Thailand. And they provided supplies into Vietnam, but they literally flew out of Thailand.
And they get shot at?
So when they were over Vietnam, they were attacked by MiGs.
Oh yeah.
So it was kind of bizarre because he would fly missions, sometime during the day into Vietnam. They would be attacked by MiGs.
What is that?
What?
MiGs?
MiGs were Russian fighter planes that were supplied to the North Vietnamese.
Okay.
And of course they received ground fire. I think the funniest story he ever told me was that they flew a big pig, a wild boar, in to give to a village because we were trying to pacify the villages in Vietnam. And the boar was on do you know what a pallet is? A wooden pallet?
Yeah.
So he was tied into a wooden pallet. But when they got in the air, he broke loose and was moving around and completely threw the C-130, out of balance.
Yeah.
And so finally, to solve the problem, the back of the plane opened with a ramp, and they pushed the pig out. And so the village got a pig, but I guess by then it was splattered.
Yeah. Still a pig though.
Yeah.
Maybe
So
not the pig they wanted.
I had a close friend who was an FO, a forward observer, for the Army, which was for the artillery always had a forward observer that would call in the shots from the artillery unit. So he would be right on the front lines, whereas the artillery would be behind the front lines. And to show how bizarre some of the directives were for those of us who were just soldiers. His job, besides calling in coordinates for his artillery unit, were to count dead oxen and cows, because then we compensated the South Vietnamese for any losses.
Probably didn't do much.
And he spent more time, counting dead animals than he did calling in coordinates, which he thought was just a total waste of time.
Yeah. I
But-
imagine they didn't really do much better after getting a bunch of cows and oxen.
Right. So I had another close friend who was in the special services, and he was in Cambodia and in southern in southern Cambodia, right on the adjacent to Vietnam. There was a tribe in the hills called Montagnards, and he trained the Montagnards, which were relatively small people, no taller than maybe 5 feet, as soldiers. And he said they were the toughest soldiers he ever met.
Wow.
But that brings up the really critical thing that had more to do with the demise of our forces in Vietnam than anything else, and that was what we called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that was a trail, it wasn't paved, but it was cleared out of the jungle. And it went through Cambodia next to Vietnam. And it allowed the NVAs, the North Vietnamese Army, to supply both VC and NVAs at any point along the way. And the policy that was handed down from the Pentagon was that Americans couldn't interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we were fighting, and they were being supplied, and we couldn't cut off their supplies because it was in Cambodia. Never mind that the North Vietnamese didn't get permission from the Cambodians to come there. So this is, one of those anachronisms of war, and I think, it gives an indication of the underpinnings that were broken in fighting the war. The other thing was that my special services officer, whenever they would go on a raid against the North Vietnamese, they always had to tell their counterparts in the South Vietnamese Army what they were going to do ahead of time. And the North Vietnamese had infiltrated the South Vietnamese Army. So he said every time he went on a raid, it was broken up by the North Vietnamese because they had advance warning of it.
It's unmotivating.
It made it made it impossible to really execute decisive military actions.
Yeah, and actually make any progress too.
Right.
Huh? Hold on. To log on here. How would you say the Vietnam War and the social movement separately impacted your daily life and those around you?
Well, the anti-war protesters demonized those of us who were in the service. They would spit on us. They would throw bottles of urine on us. They made our life hell, and we had no. We weren't responsible for the fact that we were there. We weren't responsible for the strategy that was being exercised out of the Pentagon. We were simply the foot soldiers, and it infuriated us.
Yeah.
And to this day, I really despise. They were hippies. They were. They didn't want to be drafted into the service. They didn't want to serve their country, and so they were really looked down upon by us. And I told you yesterday the story of my friend who was in the Navy and on the ship the Pueblo, which was captured in the middle of the Vietnam War by the North Koreans, and he was imprisoned for 11 months in North Korea and beaten badly by the North Koreans. Yet when he came out, when he was finally freed after 11 months, who did the war protesters, attack? Were people like him. And of all the people that I've personally known, and including John McCain, this guy, Skip Schumacher, was really the bravest of the brave. And under really severe circumstances, where he was being starved, he was being beaten daily, stood up and resisted. Helped organize the the crew of the ship to resist in ways that the North Koreans didn't understand, but the outside world would. And I told you some of those symbols that they used. So he endured 11 months of deprivation, which frankly, he was one of my best friends. Changed his life forever. I mean, it haunted him for the rest of his life.
Probably.
And I was with him when he died. So it's, I just, so I don't have any respect for those. If they wanted to protest the war, that's a freedom that we Americans have. But when they direct it against innocent participants, for me, that crossed the line.
Yeah.
Now, in 1966, I ran for a seat in the Missouri House of Representatives and was elected in the fall. I served then 2 years. I was re-elected in 1968, served another 2 years, then re-elected in 1970. So that was all during.
So you had 3 terms?
Yeah, I served 3 terms, 6 years. But that was all during the pendency of the war, and the protesters had absolutely no impact on the election process, at least where I was running. I had once, a man came up to me and accosted me for not protesting the war. But other than that, the protest movement had absolutely no political impact in Missouri. In a sense, they kind of reinforced what I called sort of the silent majority that viewed themselves as loyal Americans. And of course, we reviled Jane Fonda, who went to North Vietnam, to Hanoi, and expressed her opposition to the war through the North Vietnamese, really encouraged the North Vietnamese that the protesters could shape the course of the war. So I think she's probably the most hated American at the time. And to this day, I see friends of mine who were in the service with me at the time, and we still refer to her as Hanoi Jane. The other interesting character that I didn't run into, but later afterwards in the 90s, I was close to Bob Dole, who was a senator from Kansas, was the majority leader in the Senate and ran for president in 1996, was beaten by Bill Clinton, was John Kerry. John Kerry had been about 3 or 4 years behind me at Yale and was kind of a showboat at Yale. He was assigned to service, he was in the Navy with what we called fast boats, which were kind of like PT boats from World War II that maintained control of the Mekong Valley, Mekong River, excuse me. I had a number of friends that were on those fast boats, and they would regale me with stories of how they went water skiing up and down the Mekong River with 50 caliber machine guns on both sides, spraying the shore so they wouldn't get shot at while they were water skiing. But they thought that Kerry was a showboat. They didn't like him, and when Kerry ran for president, they all formed a group that raised money and opposed John Kerry. And those were close. Those were very close friends of mine. Bob Dole. One time I was in the majority leader's office in the Senate with him, and we were talking about Kerry. This was before he ran. And there were two things. First of all, after he got out of the Navy and he was running for a prosecuting attorney in the county in Massachusetts, he turned on the Marines and soldiers that he had fought with, and said we'd created deprivations, in Vietnam, without any real proof of it. Of course, we'd had the My Lai massacre, which, was wrong, was, somebody gone crazy. But other than that, and the other Kerry, there were two Kerrys two John Kerrys that were senators. Well, I think one was from either Iowa or Nebraska, and then there was John Kerry from Massachusetts. The one from Iowa was with the equivalent of a SEAL. I think we called them UDTs at the time, underwater demolition teams. And he had taken part in a raid, and they'd killed innocent civilians, but it was simply due to what we call the fog of war. That you've got people shooting at you. They're coming at you from all different directions, and sometimes you shoot the wrong person. It's just that's a fact of war. But John Kerry from Massachusetts turned on us and said how despicable we were. And I think that really galvanized those of us who had been in the service during the Vietnam War to oppose him when he ran for president, and he lost. Incidentally, afterwards, when he was back in the Senate, a businessman who he'd raised money from to oppose Kerry was nominated, I guess by Bush, to be an ambassador to a little country. I think it was Luxembourg, so it wasn't a big deal. but Kerry blocked his appointment as ambassador simply because he contributed to the campaign against him, and I thought that was the height of it was so petty to me that in politics
you really couldn't get over it, huh?
Yeah, I couldn't, but I mean, here's this guy who's going to be ambassador to Luxembourg. I mean,
still a big title regardless of how big the country is.
He just, but that was John Kerry, so that gives you some of my experiences. I don't know.
That's good. Thank you. Actually, I had a question that I thought of while we were talking. Is the Vietnam War and the social movements really like it has been depicted in movies like Apocalypse Now or other ones?
Well, I mean, I certainly saw it firsthand, being in the States, during much of the Vietnam War. My practical experience was holding public office, that the protesters didn't really have much influence over policy. I think the Vietnam War was lost because of the decisions that were made from the higher ups, the president and McNamara, who'd been the president of Ford Motor and then became Secretary of Defense. I had a friend in the Marine Corps who was for a time stationed in Fort Meade, just outside of Washington, D.C. And he told me that daily they would fly a B-52 over from Vietnam with all the current reconnaissance, and then they would take it to the Pentagon and to the White House to be reviewed, and then the decision for the next day as to what targets were going to be exercised against were made either in the Pentagon or the White House in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
And I was trained to fight in jungles, and you can't control that kind of fighting, 7,000 miles away.
Yeah.
Without any understanding of the terrain or what you're up against. And I think it was things like that really undermined the war.
Yeah.
And what happened was, after the first year or two, the troops became aware of those anomalies, and they lost a lot of their fighting spirit. So the troops later in the war were much more demoralized. They started smoking marijuana as a way to escape the reality of the situation they were in. They would drink. I had another friend who was a sergeant, and he went in country, and his unit, his platoon, one of the members was sick or something and didn't go. But he was carried on the roster the whole 13 months while my friend was in country. And he was paid, but he wasn't there. So my friend, who was the squad leader, collected his salary, and he used it to buy beer for his platoon.
Wow.
So when he came back, of course the auditors pieced it together what had happened.
Yeah.
And they were going to court-martial him, and when they interviewed him, he told them exactly what he'd done. He'd just taken the money and used it to buy beer for his troops, to maintain their morale. And so the court-martial disappeared. He was never court-martialed, and that was the end of it. But those are the anomalies that you deal with in war.
Yeah. Did it start out that way? Like, were troops always... Was it kind of like a drugs, like just fun scene there? Were they actually surfing on the beaches the whole time, or did that just start when they found out the anomalies?
I think morale was very high in the early stages of the war. but it went downhill because of these kind of anomalies that I'm talking. And I think what the troops concluded was that Johnson and McNamara were not fighting a war to win it. You know, they were just simply fighting to maintain the status quo. And I had another close friend. He was a platoon leader in the Army, and he was leading his platoon through the jungle, and the NVAs had put in a APM, we call them anti-personnel mine, and it was triggered. They put a tripwire across the trail in the jungle, and when you broke the tripwire, that then caused the APM to fly up in the air, and then it exploded, and so it exploded in his face, right? And shrapnel hit his face. Fortunately for him, it didn't hit his eyes.
Wow.
But he was peppered with it, and of course, obviously, he was taken out of combat.
Yeah.
But years later, when I was with him, maybe 20 years later, periodically pieces of shrapnel would work their way out of his skin.
Yeah.
You know, and he'd have these sores from when the metal came out.
Yeah.
But he told me that, by then, this was later in the war, that the soldiers no longer, they didn't have the morale to win. They didn't understand why we were, fighting in the jungles in this country, in Vietnam, not to protect Americans, not to save America from invasion, but simply on the theory that this was the Rice Bowl of Southeast Asia, and we didn't want it to fall into communist hands. And it was a storyline that didn't sell. Mm-hmm. And I think that undermined it. There was a general in the Army at the outset of the war, I think his name was Lucius Clay, who had warned Johnson never to fight a land war on the Asian mass, because those populations were so much larger than ours that we could never put enough troops to overwhelm them. And the doctrine when I was doing my infantry training was that basically to take a position to overwhelm it, you had to have a ratio of about 5 to 1. And in Vietnam, it was more the other way.
Yeah.
And so
maybe even more too.
It so the math never worked. And despite all the technology that we had then and still have today, when you're a group of men in a jungle, you've lost all that advantage.
Yeah.
It's simply up to the human will, the skill of the individuals on both sides.
Yeah.
And so
on the other side, they were maybe more familiar with the jungle and were able to navigate easier.
Yeah. They basically had the population on their side because they would intimidate the villages, and if the villagers didn't support them, they inflicted punitive measures on them, and so we never really had a strong local, what we would call indigenous support. I mean, later the Marine Corps developed a system for turning that problem around by helping communities that were in the middle of the war and getting them to support us.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't have that strategy in Vietnam. So it just so it was just a culmination. I mean, here I am, just a poor Marine grunt, and yet I knew, we would talk about all this stuff, and it just didn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think while the peace movement in the United States may have had some impact on national politics, it didn't have the support that people now try and characterize it as. It was, as I say, they tactically made the mistake of demonizing, those of us who
Have no responsibility for anything.
Yeah, so that created a lot of ire and a lot of hate, really. I think hate is probably the best word I could describe as to how we felt about the protesters. So they didn't impact us. I mean, they had a reverse impact, of course. So I think it was, yes, first of all, I think the casualty list became so enormous that popular support for the war dissipated, and so the protesters were protesting that, but I think it was more the impact of communities, seeing their children coming back either wounded and maimed or dead, in caskets.
Mm-hmm.
I have some friends whose names are on the wall, and that again is a very powerful, political weapon. Wars are basically acts of diplomacy. They're not, some politician, whether it's a dictator or, from a democratically elected society, makes the decision to go to war. Now, the Second World War, which I grew up in, was different in that we were attacked by the Japanese, and so we had no choice.
Yeah.
And
there might have been a foreseeable benefit, maybe something that was tangible.
Well, I mean, there was fear, particularly right after the Japanese, attacked our Navy in Hawaii, that we were going to be invaded. And the Japanese did take the Aleutian Islands, which were fairly close to Alaska. And when I was police commissioner of the city of St. Louis, my driver had been in the Army, and he had fought in the Aleutian Islands. So the fear of being invaded was real at the time. My father, who had been a lieutenant in the Army artillery in the 30s and therefore was too old by the time of the war, he was our neighborhood air warden. And we had a chart, so what, 10 by 10, and we had the silhouettes on it of all the Japanese and German planes, so that we would be able to spot them. And I remember trying to memorize those. And during the winter, my grandparents lived in Florida on the East Coast, and I was sent down there a lot. The rest of my family were all in the service. And my grandmother would take me to the beach in Palm Beach, and I'd sit there as a little boy, making sandcastles or whatever, I had my pail and my shovel.
Yeah.
But the whole horizon, I think the horizon is about 38 miles till you can't see, because the curvature of the earth, prevents you from seeing. And so the whole horizon was filled with ships. I mean, hundreds of them.
Wow.
And I didn't understand that. I learned later. But what had happened was that the Germans had sent U-boats over. And so all commercial shipping was close in to shore, and it was in convoys. And so what I was seeing as a little boy, were these convoys going by. Well, one day, all of a sudden, there was this black smoke. I mean, it just filled the sky. It was oil burning. And what I pieced together, I don't know this as a fact, was that a German U-boat had snuck in and sank an oil tanker. Right in front of my eyes. So what I'm
That's
saying,
scary.
the threat to the United States was very real.
Yeah.
And so the whole country was really united, in supporting the war effort. My sister and I, I had a little red wagon, and we go up and down the block collecting tin cans because they were needed for armaments. So it wasn't, today we try and sort out renewable stuff for recycling.
Yeah.
But then it was for recycling for armaments. I mean, very
Like just for general things that use
yeah,
metal.
no, not just because you should recycle, but because the tin was needed. You see, for wartime manufacture, and Union Station, which was the big train station in St. Louis, when my mother would take me down there, because my father's cousins were all in the Navy, and St. Louis was kind of a cross point from East Coast to West Coast. So when they would be transferred from, say, the East Coast to the West Coast or vice versa, then the service people would go by train, and I have this vivid picture in my mind of being at Union Station, and it was a station, where the trains backed in, and then there was a headway there. Forgotten what they called it, but anyway, I would see thousands of men in uniforms, and they were traversing the United States, or they were coming home on leave. I mean, it was just it was an overwhelming sight, just to be surrounded by all these uniforms. People coming on, getting on trains, getting off.
Yeah.
Meeting family. It just. But that was the sense of unity that we had in the country.
And with the Vietnam War, that wasn't there.
Yeah, that wasn't there, and that was Johnson's fault, because he was fighting a war that didn't impact us directly, and so basically, using modern terms, he couldn't market it, and I think that's what undid it more than anything else. And of course, we had 50,000 dead.
Yeah. There's no way to market that
But compare that to my great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. You know how many Americans were killed in the Civil War?
A lot, right?
600,000.
Yeah.
We had more people killed in the Civil War than Americans lost in the Spanish-American War, the First World War, the Second World War, and Korea.
Wow.
I mean, that's...
Yeah.
Think of what the impact was, on American society then. But
Probably
again,
humongous.
yeah. But it, so it permeated everything. When we'd go to the movies, at the beginning they would always have a clip called War News, and we would get the war news at a movie theater because we didn't have television sets then. The way I learned about the atom bomb being dropped on Nagasaki was listening to the radio.
Wow.
There was an announcement on the radio. And I remember up and down our block, the celebration when the bomb was dropped, because we knew that was the end of the war. Much later in my life, there was sort of a movement here to condemn the dropping of the atom bomb. And my wife and I were in France, in southern France, and we were eating in an outdoor restaurant, and there was a couple our age at the next door table, and so we started talking to them, and they were asking about, because the press was going through this sort of reappraisal of whether we should have dropped the A-bomb, and they said, this couple said to us, if you, and they were I think from Belgium or Netherlands, no, I think from Belgium. If you all hadn't dropped the bomb, we'd be dead, because both of them, his husband and his wife, they were in the colony of Batavia in the Indo-Pacific, and they were interred by the Japanese, and they said they were about to starve, and if the war hadn't ended then, they would have starved to death.
Wow.
So, you know, war is a terrible thing.
Yeah.
But that's why I think, you know, I think our political leaders have learned that, you know, it can't be entered into lightly.
Yeah.
And I think that's the lesson of Vietnam.
Thank you. Should I tell Mimi to turn that off?
It's okay.
Good time.
You want to pause it or not?
Wait. All right, here's an interesting question. What role, if any, did music, literature, or art play in the anti-war movement during that time? Did any songs or works stand out to you?
I don't have any recollection of any music that really, you know, impacted.
Yeah.
There was. There was an element of society that just wanted to be left alone, I think.
Yeah.
And so I think some of the music may reflect that. But I'm the wrong person to ask that question.
All right, well, thank you for trying. Okay, yeah. How did you personally respond to the news of events like the Tet Offensive or the My Lai massacre?
My lie?
My Lai. Did these events change your view on the war?
Well, interestingly enough, because I'd been in the service, I understood that the Tet Offensive was an American victory. But the American news media didn't understand that. And they thought, because you know, our military facilities were all attacked almost simultaneously, that it had been a defeat. But in fact, what had happened was, in every instance, the NVAs and the VCs were defeated, and we learned later after the war that the North Vietnamese were entertaining maybe ending the war because of the loss at the Tet Offensive.
Wow.
But our media didn't understand that, and
So they covered it as a loss?
yeah, they covered it as a loss for us, and it wasn't. And so, you know, we live in an open society. You know, we're transparent, and sometimes in war, maybe transparency isn't a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it is what it is. And the reporters were not sophisticated enough to understand the impact. And you see, with news, you know, our society, news travels so fast. And so the reaction to it is almost simultaneous.
Yeah.
And what that prevents is a thoughtful judgment as to what's happening. And that's what I think happened with the Tet Offensive. That the attacks and attempts to take our facilities, were reported, and in the news media interpreted it that obviously we were not prepared and unable to respond to it, when in fact our military services had won a sweeping victory. And so I think that's
Must be very conflicting to have a bunch of people think that it's a loss too. And
when they don't know what they're talking about. But that's this instantaneous communication that we have today. Can create a what I would call a hyperbola.
what does that mean?
Blowing things out of proportion. And so that's what happened. I didn't personally think that Tet had been a victory for the North Vietnamese, but the news media certainly covered it that way. My lie, I think, is I was police commissioner for 4 years in the city of St. Louis, and ran a police department of 2,200 people.
It's a big department.
Yeah. So, and we probably employed close to 3,000 people, with civilians. Human nature is what it is. And so, I mean, we would have reports of police brutality, that we had to deal with all the time. And, some of it was legitimate, that, police officers had abused their position and had abused, the people that they had captured, so that the police in particular tend to view things as black and white, and they view themselves as the people that are protecting society against crime, bad things, and so in a sense they feel more entitled, and it wasn't so true when I was commissioner, but it's now true that people who were arrested in my day were much more submissive when they were arrested. Today, there's an atmosphere of rebellion, I guess you'd call it, and so people that are arrested will resist. If a person's arrested for speeding, maybe they'll just try and outrun the police.
Yeah.
So that just makes it that much tougher for them.
Yeah.
Well, we had 500,000 troops in Vietnam, 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. And we had some allies there. We had the Australians who were there. And
I didn't know that, Carl.
The possibility of there being a bad apple in 500,000 is like 100%, okay?
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. You had a lieutenant, as I remember he was. They had captured a village and they kind of went wild, shooting people. And it's a tragedy. But we have a mechanism in society to deal with that tragedy, by discipline. And I know in the police department, I had to do that. I had to fire police officers for doing bad things to civilians. And years later, after I was out of office, I had a policeman come up to me. I didn't know who he was. He identified himself. And he said, you fired me. Of course, I didn't have any recollection of that.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing. He said, that was the best thing that ever happened to me, because apparently he was an alcoholic at the time, you know, and getting fired straightened him out, and he stopped his drinking.
Wow.
Um, so, but we have a discipline, you know, as long as we have a disciplinary system and we use it, yeah, and we do it fairly, then, you know, abnormalities like myelli can be dealt with, and they're not. They're not. It wasn't systemic. It was, you know, an isolated situation. But you know, I was counsel to the governor in Missouri for 4 years, and I had to deal with some of the situations at the prisons. You know, the guards at the prisons are about 1 inch away from being the same as the prisoners.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, that's the kind of people you're dealing with, and so things can go wrong.
Yeah.
So society has to have a way of dealing with that fairly, so that people have confidence that it will be dealt with, and so when that happens, then it doesn't have you know, a major impact on society. So one of the things I did as police commissioner was we would meet monthly, and we had 9 precincts in the city of St. Louis, and so once a month we met more than once a month, but once a month we met in each one of those precincts and invited the public. And the other thing I did was internal affairs, which was the department in the police that investigated, you know, civilian complaints. I put a black officer captain in charge of that, and I never had a single claim of racism or police brutality or any of those things during my tenure as police commissioner, because we involved the community. And the really interesting thing to me was later in life, when I saw this defund the police movement, which was absurd, because when we had, like, let's see, 7, 8, 9, we had 3 precincts that were, the population was predominantly black. So when we would meet in those precincts, 3 times as many people would come to those meetings. And you know what they came for? They wanted more law enforcement. They wanted more police protection. And so this nonsense about, you know, that came out of the thing in Minnesota and the defund the police, to me ran exactly counter to what my experience had been.
Maybe with communities being more separated.
Well, but St. Louis was separated. We had, I mean, the black population was essentially segregated into.
But you got to meet at all the precincts and maybe bring more community into.
Well, we let people come and ask questions.
Yeah.
And we told them what we were going to do.
And they don't do that much more, I don't think.
Well, I don't know. You know, the police department in St. Louis is now maybe 900 compared to 2,200 when I was there. It's undermanned. The 911 system is broken down. They don't have enough people to take 911 calls. But those are all systemic problems that can be dealt with.
Yeah.
But we don't have politicians with the will to do it. Or often we don't. You know. And so you have to have the political will to deal with it, and then you have to provide the resources, and you have to convince the community that they need to pay for those resources. And I think when you do that, then you will succeed.
Yeah.
But we've gone off the Vietnam War.
We have. That's okay. It all relates to it. And I think I'm going to ask you one more question. Unless I find another good one that I want to ask you. Okay, yeah, here's a fun one. What is your favorite story from the social movement or the war?
Oh. Well, I think it's the one that I shared with you yesterday. My friend who was on the Pueblo.
Okay.
I think.
And you talked about that earlier too.
Yeah, it was. My friend was 2 years behind me in an all-boys school, and in an all-boys school, um, sports, physical activity, plays a big role in sort of the social pecking order. And he was not an athlete. He was not. He was small. He was slight. Um, and I had grown up with him because our family. He had an older sister that was my age, and our families were friends. And so my role had been with him. The way we became friends was when older kids picked on him, I protected him. But here he is. He's captured by the North Koreans, thrown into a prison where they have they suffer at the whim of the guards, and typically guards in institutions like that are as bad or worse than the prisoners.
Yeah, ruthless.
And yet he had the courage and the will to find ways to resist. And I think the important thing was the crew of the Pueblo stuck together. And they stuck together through that experience and for the rest of their lives. And to me, that's probably one of the most powerful statements. So they had faith in each other, they supported each other, and they had faith in our government, and being Americans.
That mental strength is able to keep them together, huh?
Yeah, that's what held them together. And I belonged to a little church up in northern Michigan where I live half the year, and there's a retired Navy captain there, and he told me that he had been taught when he was in the Navy that the Pueblo was something that should never have happened, it was something that went wrong. And then when he heard me talk about it, he said he changed his mind 180 degrees.
Are you guys doing homework?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when he learned how the crew stuck together, they kept the chain of command, they respected their captain, they really idolized him. That's just such a powerful statement.
Yeah, and even when they threatened to start shooting the youngest, and when the captain broke down, shows.
And the captain protected.
Yeah.
He
shows how much he. Here, I'm trying to do an interview right now.
So.
Shows how much he really cared about his men and his troops.
Yeah, and he was an orphan. He'd been an orphan. He grew up in Boys Town in Iowa or wherever it is. Do you know what Boys Town is? It's a community of orphans.
Are they like in an orphanage, or is it?
Yeah, they're in a big orphanage. And so, I mean, he knew firsthand what it was like to be left alone, abandoned by his family. And he would have done anything for his crew.
Yeah.
And I met him afterwards. Again, he wasn't an imposing figure, physically. But as captain of that ship, first of all, he made the key decisions, throughout the whole process, and he always protected his crew, even if it meant that it sacrificed himself. And that's what leadership's about. And I think if we teach that to people, we'll be a stronger country.
I agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a powerful story. And I have my last question for you.
Okay.
Looking at how the Vietnam War is remembered today, do you think the country has come to terms with it, or is there still unfinished business? How do you think future generations should learn about it?
Well, I think the key is that war is a horrible thing. Um, you know, I mean, I was only touched tangentially, and yet, you know, I felt the pain of it.
Yeah.
And so entering into a war is something that shouldn't be done lightly or you know, for some esoteric reason, you know, that Vietnam was part of the rice bowl of Asia, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it just and so I think the country's learned that. At least that's my view. You know, we really haven't had any significant wars since Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Iraq and Afghanistan, but you know, but those were more expeditions, I would call them, than wars.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what the country hasn't learned is that when we do extend our military power, we can't walk away from it without having made our point. And that's what happened in Afghanistan, for instance. So I mean that, you know, so that so the lesson of Vietnam is you don't put the country into a major conflict that puts it at risk thousands of lives
For no reason.
for
No
it's not no reason.
good reason.
It has to be a reason that threatens our being, our welfare, our existence.
We just didn't like the idea of communism.
Well, I mean, we were in what was called the Cold War,
Yeah.
and communism was a real threat to the world at the time, and the world was divided, you know, and you had on the communism was a form of dictatorship, and so we've always espoused democracy, and so you know, I certainly supported the Cold War, but we didn't fight it so much as we, you know, as it simply became sort of a chess game.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, when Reagan became president, is when we essentially overpowered, because what had happened in Russia, and I taught for a while in Riga, Latvia, which was then part of the Russian Empire. The communist form of government provided total control over industry. And so Latvia, where I taught, was deemed to be the manufacturer of telephones. So they invested all this money into telephones that the telephones as they decided they should be. So here in the United States, we're going through this revolution where, you know, when I was growing up, you had a fixed telephone, you know, connected by wires that had to go all across the country. And today, you know, we have these handheld,
Yeah.
you know, I have an iPhone, you know, I mean, it's a complete revolution.
Yeah.
Well, in Russia, that never happened because they controlled the telephone industry. And so they didn't need to change because they made all the telephones.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that they did is they overemployed them, so the telephone companies had about 3 or 4 times as many employees, and therefore they became very unwieldy. And then when the Iron Curtain, the wall in Berlin fell, and the communist countries were open to seeing the innovation and revolution, in manufacturing and technology that the free world had had.
Yeah.
It just completely overwhelmed them, and they didn't have, they hadn't kept up. So Russia had invested a lot of money in, trying to send cosmonauts up into the atmosphere.
What are those?
But they starved the people.
Yeah.
Um,
To make more technology. Huh?
Well,
Or just-
it was just a simple. It was an allocation of resources. So they built up a huge army, and they invested a lot of money in what we call the space race. But what they didn't do was they didn't create innovation and experimentation in society, because they controlled everything from a central point. And just as I said, you can't fight a war in a jungle from 7,000 miles away. They were doing essentially the same thing with the population, and that's why it broke down. And the interesting thing was when I was in Latvia in like 1990, so that was actually right around the time that the Berlin Wall came down.
Really? I thought it came down much earlier.
No.
Wow.
And I mean, maybe a couple of years, but not.
Yeah.
I think the thing that undermined the communist governments in Russia, or what was in the Soviet system, was television.
Yeah.
Because the average citizen could see what things were like in the West through television. And so the program that I remember, because I visited in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and I stayed with families there, what they told me was it was the television program Dallas that they were really fascinated with, because they thought that was typical of America.
What did it depict?
Do you know what Dallas was?
No.
So it was a television drama of a wealthy Texas family, and all the goings on back and forth, internal disputes and things like that. But what it showed was the wealth of the United States. They were driving big fancy cars. The Russian car was a Lada. The Lada was the simplest car. It functionally, I don't think it had a heater, and I've forgotten what the windshield wipers were like, but I mean, it was the most basic car.
Yeah.
And so, so the star of Dallas was driving a Cadillac convertible, And
They would get jealous.
yeah, and so that really turned them against the communist government.
Yeah. That makes sense. It almost seems like counterintuitive for the communist government to give their citizens that television program.
Well, the theory of communism, of course, is that it's a dictatorship of the people.
Mm-hmm.
But in
that's
fact,
not how it works out.
No, it became the dictatorship of the government.
Yeah.
So the people in government got special privileges.
Yeah.
But the rest of the people didn't. So, counterintuitive to the theory.
Yeah, it is.
But there was a period in the 50s and 60s where, we in America were afraid that the communists would take over.
Yeah. Was that during
And people
the Cold
were
War?
building bomb shelters in their backyards.
Yeah. Oh, no.
Fortunately, my family never did that, but
So it was real. Can't imagine what that's like. It's like a big thing. Getting nuked would not be fun.
yeah, I don't know. I don't know. So are we finished, or we have more?
That's Good. Maybe I have another one I could ask you. All right. Did the war move and the movement create any um, dis- distances in relationships with friends and family or outside relationships?
Well, in my family it didn't because,
Yeah.
but I think it certainly impacted, our personal feelings towards the protesters.
Yeah.
Really, really pissed us off.
Yeah.
And so, I think that rupture healed after a while, but not immediately. So probably in some families it did
Yeah.
just disrupt the family.
Not in yours though, personally.
No,
No.
and it would have typically been a rupture between generations. The older generations would have been more supportive of the country, and
Yeah.
the younger generations were.
Who are not supportive
Yeah.
of the war. Did you have any friends who were supporting the anti-war movement?
I don't have any. I can't think of anybody right off the top of my head. I'm sure I must have, encountered some people like that.
Yeah.
But, remember I was a Marine. And,
Yeah.
So, we stuck together. I mean, to this day, having been a Marine kind of marks me. And to the extent that I encounter fellow Marines that I never knew, it creates almost an instant bond. The experience that we went through as Marines.
Yeah.
Because there's a psychological impact of it.
On all of you.
Yeah. So my regiment, did I tell you what the motto of our regiment was?
No.
There were two. The first one was, the impossible takes a little bit longer. And the other was, when the tough get going is when when the going gets tough is when the tough get going. So I look at the Army and the Marine Corps. There's not a physical difference between, the people, the soldiers and the Marines.
Yeah.
But there is a psychological difference. In the Marine Corps, you're taught that you can do things that you thought you could never do.
Yeah. Like what sort of things?
Well, I went to law school after I got out of the Marine Corps, I was still in the Marine Corps Reserve actually. Made me a much better student, because I knew how to apply myself. So when I was in law school, I'd get out of class, I'd have an early dinner and I'd go to the library and I'd sit in the library for 6 hours studying, without interruption.
That's even hard for me to do these days.
Yeah. So, but that's the Marine Corps taught me that.
Yeah.
It taught me that. We used to stand at attention when we were in Paris Island, which was boot camp, and when it was summer, and they had these, we called them sandflies, little bugs, and they would fly all over you, and then they would fly in your ear.
Oh, awful.
So, but we were not permitted to swat them. We had to stand there at attention and let them drill into our ears or whatever.
Oh, they go all the way in there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they go into the ear cavity. And so when you learn the discipline that you cannot move, they'd have us standing at attention, that you cannot move, and yet, you have a distraction like that. it then teaches you how to control yourself, you know, and not be diverted by, you know, this tiny little bug.
Yeah.
But
That goes to studying too, huh?
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, studying is discipline, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you got to concentrate.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you got to concentrate on stuff that you don't really like.
Yeah.
So, so I mean, you know, I went from having a B average at Yale to being number 8 in my law school class.
Wow.
So, and at the same time being a member of the legislature.
Yeah.
So, you know, and when I ran for the legislature, I wasn't expected to win. I went door to door to 30,000. My population was 30,000, so I went almost every door over 5 months. I just routinely every day went and knocked on doors, you know, and that was how I won because the people met me.
Yeah.
You know, so I
What's the
developed
impact on them?
I developed a relation, you know,
Yeah.
personal, you know, they knew who I was.
Yeah.
They, you know,
It's
and
not like they're just voting for someone
some
who
name,
you
yeah,
know nothing about.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean that served me. My first term, I was elected with a little over 53% of the vote, which is a healthy majority, but not, you know, not it's certainly not a landslide. My second time I ran, I got 62%.
Wow.
And the third time, 64%, which is almost 2 to 1.
Yeah.
And in a politically divided society, that's about the best you can possibly ever do.
Yeah.
But you know, what I did was, after I was elected, I would hold town hall meetings and invite everybody, and you know, they were free to ask me whatever questions I would tell. I was the first legislator in Missouri that wrote newsletters to my constituents and told them what I was doing.
Wow.
And
Gives them a sense of security, probably, and
yeah,
that you're
and
gonna
just
do what you say.
you know, and I would give them my reasons for what, you know.
Yeah.
For instance, in 69 or 69, I voted for a tax increase. That tax increase was later overturned by a statewide vote, with 56% of the state voting against it. I wrote a newsletter during that campaign, you know, to overturn that tax increase to my constituents, and I told them that I had voted for it, which, you know, most people would say was political folly to do that.
Yeah.
And I told them why I voted for it. My district voted for it. The rest of the state, 56% voted against it.
Wow.
So, but you know, I use communication skills,
Yeah.
and I found that by explaining things, that people would not punish me, even though they may not agree with me.
Yeah. Because they might see some of your reasons and
Yeah.
maybe agree with them.
Well, they knew I was,
Yeah.
and after many years after I was in the legislature, I was a Republican from the city. I was an anomaly because the city was heavily Democratic. So one of my Democratic colleagues, who'd been in the 82nd Airborne, so we had a sort of a military connection, and we had worked together in the legislature. Anyway, he wrote a book, what I'd call a memoir, about his experience, and I'll send it to you. But he wrote a chapter about me.
Wow.
And you know, about how he admired me. You know, I mean, you know, what more can you ask?
Yeah. Must be pretty grateful for that, huh?
Yeah. And so one year, I think it was in my second term, there was a big foundation that funded a meeting of legislators all over the country. And so in Missouri, they picked one House member and one Senate member. So in the House, at the time, the Democrats controlled the House 2 to 1. But they voted for me to be the member.
Wow.
So, you know, you talk about something that really touched my heart.
Yeah. You have a community of people who care about you and believe in you.
Yeah, but who are on the opposite side from me.
Yeah.
So
That
Anyway.
probably hits home even differently than if it wasn't the opposite side.
So, I mean, politics was a little different than it wasn't cutthroat like it is now.
Yeah.
And I developed personal relationships. I had to.
It's harder to develop personal relationships now, I feel.
Well, you mean because of communications?
Yeah.
You're more remote, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when I was in the Capitol, we would be in the Capitol 4 days a week, and then we'd go home for the long weekend. We'd go home Thursday afternoon and then come back Monday afternoon.
Yeah.
So I spent all my time working to build relationships with my fellow legislators who were from all over the state, all different types, and this afterwards. Years afterwards, a group of us who had served together in the legislature, we'd had an informal relationship in the when we were serving, but because they were all Democrats and I was a Republican, so we formed a group afterwards, and we met. Until last year, we met every year, and it was a mixed group. It was more Democrats, just simply because there were more Democrats in the legislature then. But it was called ROSD. You know what that stands for?
What?
The Royal Order of Shit Disturbers. But we were all the younger members of the legislature, and we challenged, the old established rules.
Mm-hmm.
And of our group, one became the mayor of St. Louis, one became the federal attorney for the Western District of Missouri, one became a member of Congress. I went on to be counsel to the governor and police commissioner.
Yeah. Wow.
So we'd all, had succeeded in later life, but we had this bond, and we always said to each other it was our time in the legislature together where we developed that bond and developed our philosophy of government.
Wow.
So it was a really powerful influence.
Yeah. A good experience probably too.
Yeah.
I got some good friends from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always considered myself lucky.
Why'd you guys stop meeting?
Oh, there were too many of us were dying off.
Oh.
Yeah, that does make it a little more difficult.
Yeah, it does. Sure does. Unfortunately.
So I mean, I was 25 when I ran for the legislature,
Yeah.
and so I was the youngest of the group.
Yeah. So it's been a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Are we still recording? No.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have another question?
That's it for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I
Thank
hope
you,
it's
Chief.
helped you.
Yeah, it'll be very helpful. I have to go re-listen to this and then type it out and
Okay.
transcribe it. Yeah. But thanks, Chief.
Can't you get AI to type it out for you?
I was gonna look into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think AI will do that.
That would be way better.
Yeah. I've
Okay.
had to type a lot out.
Yeah. Hopefully I can download the video.